The rain fell heavy over Brooklyn that October evening, drumming against the stained glass windows of St. Anthony's Church like 1,000 impatient fingers. Inside, the pews were filled with men in dark suits, their faces carved from stone, their eyes constantly scanning the room. This was not a wedding born of romance. This was business. This was survival. Clara Mancini stood at the altar in a dress of ivory silk that felt like a beautiful cage. At 23 years old, she was painfully aware that her life had never truly belonged to her. Her father, Vincenzo Mancini, had been a respected captain in the Moretti crime family until a heart attack claimed him 6 months earlier. With his death came vulnerability. A daughter with no brothers, no protection, no value except as a bargaining chip. And so the arrangement was made. Rafael Moretti stood beside her, 31 years old and already legendary in the underworld. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair slicked back and eyes the color of cold steel. His presence commanded the room without a word. He was the youngest Don in 3 generations, a man who had consolidated power through strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. He needed this marriage to solidify alliances with the remaining Mancini loyalists. She needed it to survive. The priest's words washed over them like meaningless noise. Raphael never looked at her during the ceremony. His jaw was set, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the altar. When it came time to slide the ring onto her finger, his touch was clinical, perfunctory. There was no warmth in it, no acknowledgement of the life that was being bound to his. The reception was held at Moretti's estate in Staten Island, a sprawling mansion that spoke of old money and older violence. Crystal chandeliers cast geometric shadows across marble floors. The air smelled of expensive cigars and imported wine. Men congratulated Raphael with firm handshakes and knowing looks. No one congratulated Clara. She sat at the head table like a porcelain doll, beautifully dressed and utterly invisible. It was late in the evening when Raphael finally addressed her directly. They were alone in the master bedroom, a cavernous space decorated in dark woods and burgundy fabrics. Clara stood by the window, still in her wedding dress, watching the lights of the city glimmer in the distance. She heard him enter but didn't turn around. His voice, when it came, was flat and emotionless. He told her exactly what this marriage was and wasn't. She would have his name and his protection. She would manage the household, attend family functions when required, and conduct herself with the dignity expected of a Moretti wife. But she should harbor no illusions. This was a transaction, not a partnership. She would never be his real wife, not in any way that mattered. Clara absorbed these words without flinching. She had expected nothing different, yet hearing it stated so plainly felt like being buried alive. She nodded once, a small, dignified movement, and Raphael left the room without another word. She would sleep alone on her wedding night. She would sleep alone for many nights to come. The first year of their marriage established the pattern that would define their existence together. Clara inhabited the mansion like a ghost, moving through its endless rooms with quiet purpose. She learned the routines of the household staff, memorized the names and faces of Raphael's lieutenants, and discovered which rooms were off-limits and which hours she should make herself scarce. Raphael was rarely home. His business kept him out late into the night, and when he did return, he retreated to his study or his private quarters. They saw each other at breakfast sometimes, a stilted affair where Clara poured his coffee, and he read the newspaper in silence. She learned not to ask questions. She learned not to expect answers. But Clara was observant. She noticed things. She noticed that Raphael took his coffee black with exactly 1 sugar. She noticed that he favored his right shoulder when the weather turned cold, a remnant of some old injury. She noticed that on the anniversary of his father's death, he drank alone in his study until dawn. She never mentioned these observations, she simply adjusted. An extra cushion appeared on his favorite chair. His preferred whiskey was always stocked. Small gestures that went unacknowledged but not entirely unnoticed. The mansion itself became Clara's domain. She had never had much control over her own life, but she discovered she had a talent for creating order from chaos. The household staff, initially wary of her, gradually warmed to her gentle efficiency. She didn't bark orders like Raphael's mother had. She asked politely, learned their names, remembered their children's birthdays. The cook, an elderly Italian woman named Maria, began teaching her family recipes. The head of security, a gruff former Marine named Vincent, started giving her subtle nods of approval. Brooklyn outside the mansion walls was experiencing a bitter winter. Snow piled high on street corners, and the wind off the harbor cut through the thickest coats. Clara rarely left the estate. Raphael had made it clear that her movements needed to be coordinated with security, that she represented a potential vulnerability. So she read books from the mansion's extensive library, practiced piano in the music room that no one else ever used, and watched the world through windows that felt increasingly like prison bars. There were moments when she caught Raphael watching her, brief, fleeting moments when she would look up from her book or turn from the window and find his eyes on her. But the moment their gazes met, he would look away, his expression hardening into that familiar mask of indifference. It was as if acknowledging her humanity would somehow weaken him, crack the armor he had spent a lifetime constructing. The other wives in the family treated Clara with a mixture of pity and disdain. During mandatory family dinners, they would whisper among themselves, shooting glances in her direction. They knew the truth of her marriage. They knew she was an obligation, not a choice. Some of them had been in similar situations, but time and children had granted them a legitimacy Clara seemed destined never to achieve. As winter gave way to a rainy spring, Clara felt herself becoming smaller, quieter, less substantial. She was disappearing into the role she had been assigned, fading into the wallpaper of Raphael's life. But something in her refused to completely vanish. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the last ember of hope that refused to be extinguished. She continued her small acts of service, her quiet observations, her invisible care, not because she expected anything in return, but because she didn't know how else to be. Raphael, for his part, was navigating increasingly treacherous waters in his empire. There were whispers of dissent, rumors of rival families testing his borders, questions about his ruthlessness since his father's death. Some said he had gone soft, that he was too calculated, too strategic when the old ways demanded blood and spectacle. He felt the pressure from all sides, the constant need to prove himself, to maintain the delicate balance between fear and respect that kept his world intact. In those late nights when he returned home, exhausted and wound tight with tension, he would sometimes pause outside the music room where Clara played piano. He would stand in the darkened hallway, listening to the melancholic melodies that drifted through the door. He never went in. He never acknowledged that he had been listening. But for those few minutes, some of the tension would ease from his shoulders, and he would remember that beauty could exist without violence, that gentleness was not the same as weakness. But he never told her this. He never told her anything. 2 years became 3. 3 became 4. Clara Mancini Moretti settled into a life of elegant loneliness, finding purpose in the small spaces Raphael's indifference left untended. The mansion in Staten Island became both her kingdom and her cage, a place where she exercised what little control she had while remaining fundamentally powerless in all the ways that mattered. The seasons cycled through their familiar patterns. New York summers were oppressive, the air thick and heavy with humidity that clung to skin like guilt. Clara would wake before dawn, when the house was still quiet, and sit on the terrace with her coffee, watching the city slowly come to life. These were her moments, the hours before Raphael's world imposed itself upon hers, before she had to become the invisible wife once again. Raphael's business grew more demanding, more dangerous. Clara heard things even though no one spoke directly to her. She heard the hushed conversations that ended when she entered a room. She saw the blood on shirt cuffs that appeared in the laundry. She noticed when certain men stopped coming around, when new faces replaced familiar ones. The violence that sustained their lifestyle remained just out of sight, but its presence was constant, like the low rumble of thunder promising a storm that never quite arrived. There were close calls, a shooting outside a restaurant where Raphael was dining, a car bomb that failed to detonate. Each incident sent ripples through the household, tightened security, added new protocols. Clara learned to read the atmosphere of the house, to sense when something had gone wrong even before any official word came down. On those nights, she would ensure Raphael's favorite meal was prepared, that his study was undisturbed, that everything in his domain was exactly as it should be. He never thanked her. She never expected him to. The other women in the family began to view Clara differently as time passed. Her patience, her grace under the weight of Raphael's indifference, earned a grudging respect. During family gatherings, they would seek her out now, include her in their conversations. They talked about their children, their homes, their husbands' habits and irritations. Clara listened more than she spoke, offering smiles and sympathetic nods. She never mentioned that her own marriage bed remained as cold as the day she had entered it, that she still slept alone in a room down the hall from her husband. Maria, the cook, became Clara's closest confidant, though their conversations remained carefully bounded by the unspoken rules of the household. Over shared cups of coffee in the kitchen, Maria would tell stories of the old days when Raphael's father had run things with an iron fist and his mother had been a force of nature. She spoke of Raphael as a boy, serious and watchful even then, bearing responsibilities no child should carry. Clara began to understand that the man who had married her out of duty had never known any other kind of relationship, had been raised to see connection as weakness and love as a liability. This understanding didn't make the loneliness easier, but it provided context, a framework for comprehending the walls he had built. Clara found herself wondering what Raphael might have been in a different life, with different choices, but such speculation was pointless. They were who they were, trapped in roles neither had chosen but both had to perform. The 4th year of their marriage brought autumn rain that seemed to last for weeks. Clara developed a routine of reading in the library during these storms, curled up in a leather chair near the fireplace while rain lashed against the windows. It was during one of these afternoons that Raphael unexpectedly appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a long moment, and Clara looked up from her book, surprised by his presence in the middle of the day. He looked tired, she noticed. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and there was a weight in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For a moment something seemed to hover between them, some possibility of conversation or connection. But then his phone rang, shattering whatever spell had been forming, and he turned away to answer it. When he finished the call, he was already moving toward his study, and the moment was gone as if it had never existed. Clara returned to her book, but she couldn't focus on the words. That brief moment of recognition, the way he had looked at her as if really seeing her for the first time in years, stayed with her. It was such a small thing, barely worth noting, yet it felt significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She wondered if he felt it too, or if she was simply projecting her own desperate need for connection onto neutral moments. Winter came again, the 5th winter of their marriage. Brooklyn was blanketed in snow that turned gray and ugly within days, piled high along sidewalks and turned to treacherous ice on steps. Clara had developed a small circle of activities outside the mansion by now, carefully coordinated with Vincent and his security team. She volunteered at a community center in Bensonhurst, teaching English to new immigrants. Raphael had approved this with a curt nod when Vincent presented the idea, seeing it as good public relations for the family. These hours at the community center were the only times Clara felt fully real, fully present. The people she worked with knew nothing of her married name or the world she came from. To them, she was simply Clara, the patient teacher who never raised her voice and always had time to explain things one more time. She helped elderly Russians practice their pronunciation, taught Chinese mothers the words they needed for their children's schools, and gave Vietnamese teenagers confidence in their adopted language. Their gratitude was uncomplicated and genuine, so different from the complex hierarchies and unspoken rules of Raphael's world. One evening in late February, Clara was preparing dinner with Maria when Vincent appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression grim. He told Maria to go home immediately, told Clara to go to her room and lock the door. Something in his tone made Clara's blood run cold. She saw other men moving through the house with weapons drawn, saw security monitors being checked, heard terse communications crackling over radios. The house was going into lockdown. Clara retreated to her room as instructed, but she couldn't just wait passively. She moved to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. Outside, she could see additional security vehicles arriving, men taking up positions around the perimeter. Something was coming. Some threat was imminent, and Raphael was out there somewhere, in the path of whatever danger had triggered this response. The hours that followed were among the longest of Clara's life. She sat in the darkened room, listening to footsteps in the hallways, muffled voices, the sound of cars coming and going. No one came to update her. No one told her what was happening. She was, as always, peripheral to the real action, kept safe and ignorant in equal measure. It was nearly midnight when she heard the front door open and several people entering. She recognized Raphael's voice, clipped and angry, issuing orders. He was alive. He was home. Relief flooded through her so intensely that she had to sit down, suddenly weak. Only in that moment did she fully realize how terrified she had been, how much the thought of something happening to him had devastated her. She waited an appropriate amount of time, then ventured downstairs. The house was quiet again, most of the extra security having departed. She found Vincent in the kitchen pouring himself a drink. When he saw her, he gave her a weary nod and told her there had been an attempt on Raphael, a coordinated ambush that had been narrowly avoided thanks to intelligence they had received hours earlier. 3 of their men were wounded, but would survive. The attackers had all been killed or captured. Clara absorbed this information quietly, then asked where Raphael was now. Vincent gestured toward the study. He warned her that the boss was not in a good mood, that she might want to wait until morning. But Clara found herself moving toward that closed door anyway, drawn by something she didn't fully understand. She knocked softly and entered without waiting for a response. Raphael was standing by the window, his back to the door, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His suit jacket was off, his shirt partially unbuttoned, and she could see a bandage on his forearm. He didn't turn when she entered. Clara moved into the room, stopping a respectful distance away. She didn't say anything, didn't ask if he was all right or demand explanations. She simply stood there, a quiet presence in the darkness. After a long moment, Raphael finally turned to look at her. His eyes, usually so carefully guarded, were raw, with something she had never seen before. Not quite vulnerability, but something close to it. Recognition, perhaps. Acknowledgement that she was there, that she had been worried, that it mattered. But even then, he didn't speak. The moment stretched between them, heavy with all the things that remained unsaid. Then Raphael turned back to the window, and Clara understood that she was dismissed. She left the study quietly, closing the door behind her. But something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed. They both felt it, even if neither could name it. The spring that followed was marked by increased tension in Raphael's world. The failed ambush had been a declaration of war, and war required constant vigilance. Clara saw even less of her husband than before, though she felt his presence in the house more acutely. It was as if that moment in his study had created a new awareness between them, a silent acknowledgement of the other's existence that couldn't be taken back. June arrived hot and sticky, the kind of heat that made the city feel like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Clara had been married to Raphael Moretti for 5 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Not that she was counting, except she was in the quiet moments in the spaces between the silence, wondering if this was all her life would ever be. The tension that had been building for months was reaching a critical point. Clara could feel it in every interaction, see it in the tight lines around Vincent's eyes, hear it in the hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. Raphael had barely been home in weeks, and when he was, he moved through the house like a storm preparing to break, all dark energy and barely contained violence. It was a Thursday evening when everything fell apart. Clara was in the music room, playing piano as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. She had learned a new piece, something melancholic and beautiful, and she lost herself in the music the way she always did, letting it fill the hollow spaces inside her that nothing else could reach. She didn't hear the first gunshots. The piano was too loud, and the music room was in the east wing away from the main action. But she felt the change in the air, that electric charge that precedes disaster. Her hands stilled on the keys, and in the sudden silence she heard it. Shouting. More gunshots. The sound of breaking glass. And underneath it all, the organized chaos of Vincent's security team responding to an active threat. Clara's first instinct was to hide, to follow the protocol she had been taught for exactly this scenario. There was a panic room in the basement, reinforced and stocked for emergencies. That's where she was supposed to go. That's what Raphael had made her promise she would do if anything like this ever happened. But Clara didn't move toward the basement. She moved toward the chaos. Something primal and overwhelming had taken control of her limbs. Some certainty that transcended rational thought. Raphael was in danger. That was the only thing that mattered. 5 years of being invisible, of being unloved, of being nothing more than a political convenience, and still, the thought of losing him was unbearable. She ran through the hallways in her bare feet, the sounds of violence growing louder. She passed one of the security team, bleeding from a shoulder wound but still functional, who grabbed her arm and tried to redirect her to safety. Clara wrenched free with a strength she didn't know she possessed and kept running. She heard him calling after her, but she didn't stop. The main hall was a scene from a nightmare. Furniture overturned, bullet holes in the walls, blood on the marble floors. 3 men she didn't recognize lay dead or dying. 2 of Raphael's people were taking cover behind the grand staircase, returning fire toward the front entrance. And there, near the entrance to his study, was Raphael. He was fighting hand-to-hand with a man nearly his size, both of them grappling for control of a weapon. Raphael's face was a mask of lethal focus, but Clara saw what he didn't. Another man, coming from the side, raising a gun with Raphael directly in his sights. The shooter's finger was already tightening on the trigger. Clara didn't think. Thinking would have stopped her, would have reminded her of all the reasons this was insane. She ran, covering the distance in seconds that felt like hours. She crashed into Raphael just as the gun fired, her body shielding his, changing the trajectory of both their falls. The impact was tremendous, driving them both to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The pain came a heartbeat later, blooming in her side like fire, like lightning, like every terrible thing she had ever imagined. Clara gasped, the sound lost in the continuing chaos, and distantly heard Raphael roaring with a rage she had never heard from him before. But the sound was getting farther away and her vision was starting to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. She was aware of strong arms lifting her, of Raphael's face above hers, transformed by an emotion she couldn't quite name through the pain and the growing fog. She wanted to tell him it was okay, that she had chosen this, that after 5 years of not mattering, she had finally done something that meant something. But the words wouldn't come, and the darkness was rising like a tide, and Clara let herself be pulled under. The next awareness was confused, fragmented, bright lights and urgent voices, the smell of antiseptic and fear, hands on her, professional and impersonal, doing things that hurt, and through it all, a warm pressure on her hand, someone holding on to her like she was the only thing anchoring them to earth. She tried to open her eyes but couldn't quite manage it. She tried to squeeze the hand that held hers and thought maybe she succeeded because she heard a voice, rough and broken, saying her name like a prayer. Time became meaningless. There was pain, and then medication that pushed the pain away but left her floating in a strange in-between place. There were moments of semi-consciousness where she could hear sounds but couldn't quite surface enough to make sense of them. A machine beeping steadily, low voices in serious conversation, and always that presence beside her, that hand holding hers, that anchor in the storm. When Clara finally truly woke, it was to pale morning light filtering through unfamiliar curtains. She was in a bed, but not her bed. The room was large and masculine, decorated in dark colors and heavy furniture. Raphael's room, his private sanctuary, where she had never been invited in 5 years of marriage. And there, slumped in a chair beside the bed, exhausted and unshaven, was Raphael himself. He was asleep, but his sleep looked anything but restful. His hand still rested on the bed near hers, as if he had been holding it and only let go when sleep finally claimed him. There was blood on his shirt, dark stains that made her heart clench. For a terrible moment she thought he was hurt, but then she realized it was her blood, transferred from carrying her. Clara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through her side, sharp enough to make her gasp. The sound, quiet as it was, brought Raphael instantly awake. His eyes snapped open and for a moment there was disorientation, confusion. Then his gaze found hers, and something like relief crashed across his features with such intensity that it took her breath away. He moved to the bed, his hands hovering over her as if he wanted to touch her but was afraid of causing more pain. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse, wrecked. He asked her what she had been thinking, why she had done something so impossibly reckless. But there was no anger in the words, only a kind of desperate bewilderment, as if she had just rewritten every rule he had ever known. Clara tried to answer, tried to explain, but her throat was dry and her voice wouldn't cooperate. Raphael quickly poured water from a pitcher on the nightstand, supporting her head gently while she sipped. The tenderness in the gesture was so foreign, so unexpected, that Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. She hadn't cried in years, had taught herself not to, but suddenly the walls she had built to survive their marriage were crumbling, and she couldn't stop the tears from coming. Raphael looked stricken, like her tears were more painful to him than any physical wound. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle her, and did something he had never done before. He reached out and brushed the tears from her cheeks with his thumb, the gesture achingly gentle. He told her not to cry, that she was safe now, that everything was going to be okay. But his own eyes were suspiciously bright and his voice kept breaking on the words. The doctor came then, summoned by some alert system Clara hadn't noticed. He was one of the family doctors, accustomed to treating injuries that couldn't be explained to hospitals. He examined Clara's wound, changed her dressing, and pronounced her incredibly lucky. The bullet had passed through her side without hitting any vital organs. She would heal, though it would take time and she would have a scar. He left additional medication, strict instructions for her care, and a warning to Raphael that she needed rest, not stress. After the doctor left, Raphael seemed at a loss. He stood by the window, his back to her, shoulders rigid with tension. Clara watched him. This man who had been her husband for 5 years but had remained a stranger, and saw him truly vulnerable for the first time. The walls he had maintained so carefully, the emotional distance that had defined their marriage, all of it had been shattered in the moment she had thrown herself into the line of fire for him. Clara finally found her voice, rough but functional. She told him she had done it because she couldn't watch him die. That simple, that complicated. She didn't elaborate, didn't explain that somewhere in the 5 years of silence and loneliness, she had fallen in love with a man who barely acknowledged her existence. She didn't tell him that her quiet acts of service, her invisible care, had all been expressions of a love she had never been allowed to speak, but maybe he heard it anyway, in what she didn't say. Raphael turned from the window and his face was transformed. All the careful control, all the practiced indifference gone. What remained was raw and honest and almost frightening in its intensity. He crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, taking her hand in both of his. His voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper, as if the words were being torn from somewhere deep inside him. He told her that he had been a fool, that he had spent 5 years treating her like she didn't matter when she had been the only real thing in his entire world. He told her that when he saw her fall, when he saw her blood, something in him had broken irreparably. He told her that he had sat beside her bed for 2 days, terrified that she would die, that he would lose her before he ever really had her, before he told her the truth he had been hiding from himself. He told her she was his heart, his conscience, his only connection to anything good, that watching her, listening to her play piano when she thought no one knew, seeing the way she moved through his world with grace and kindness, had slowly undone him. He had fought it, resisted it, told himself that caring was weakness, but she had proven that caring was the greatest strength of all, and he had been wrong about everything. Clara listened to this confession with tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking and healing simultaneously. 5 years of silence, and now Raphael Moretti, the man who never explained himself to anyone, was laying himself bare before her. She reached up with her free hand, ignoring the pain the movement caused, and touched his face. He leaned into her palm like a man dying of thirst finally finding water. They stayed like that for a long time, words finally exhausted, simply existing in this new reality they had created. Outside, the world continued with all its violence and complications. But in this room, in this moment, there was only truth. Only the acknowledgement of what had always been there, buried under duty and fear and carefully maintained distance. Recovery was slow and painful, but Clara had never been happier. The physical wound in her side healed gradually, but the emotional wounds of 5 years of loneliness dissolved like morning fog under the intensity of Raphael's newfound attention. He barely left her side those first weeks, personally overseeing every aspect of her care with a diligence that bordered on obsessive. Vincent and the other men in the organization watched this transformation with barely concealed amazement. The boss they had known, cold and calculating, had been replaced by someone they hardly recognized. Raphael, who had never shown weakness, who had maintained absolute emotional control in all situations, was now openly devoted to his wife. He held her hand during meals, sat with her for hours while she rested, and looked at her with an expression that could only be described as adoration. Maria, the cook, cried happy tears when she saw them together. She had watched Clara's quiet suffering for years, had seen the gentle woman trying so hard to matter to a man who seemed determined not to notice. Now, seeing Raphael touch Clara's face tenderly, seeing him smile at something she said, seeing the way he couldn't seem to stop looking at her, Maria felt vindicated in her faith that good people were sometimes rewarded. The family gossip network worked overtime trying to understand what had happened. The other wives, who had pitied Clara for so long, now looked at her with something approaching envy. Everyone knew about the attack, about how she had thrown herself in front of a bullet meant for Raphael. The story had taken on mythic proportions, growing with each retelling. But what they couldn't quite comprehend was the complete transformation in Raphael himself. The ice that had defined him for so long had melted, revealing someone capable of profound tenderness. Clara herself was still adjusting to this new reality. She would wake in the morning still in Raphael's bed where he had kept her during her recovery, and find him already awake and watching her. The intensity in his eyes should have been frightening, but instead it made her feel cherished, protected, seen in a way she had never been before. He would ask how she slept, if she was in pain, if she needed anything, and when she assured him she was fine, he would kiss her forehead with a gentleness that made her throat tight. As summer deepened and her strength returned, they began to have real conversations. 5 years of marriage, and they were only now learning each other's stories, hopes, fears. Raphael talked about his childhood, about the weight of his father's expectations, about being raised to see emotion as liability. He talked about watching his mother endure a loveless marriage and promising himself he would never be vulnerable like that. He explained that when he married Clara, he had already decided to keep her at a distance, to never let her matter enough to hurt him. But she had slipped past his defenses anyway, he admitted. Her quiet presence, her patient kindness, the way she never demanded anything from him, had slowly undone his carefully constructed walls. He had found himself looking for her in the house, listening for the sound of her playing piano, noticing when she smiled, and it had terrified him, that growing attachment. So he had pushed back harder, maintained the distance more rigidly, convinced himself that she was just an obligation, until the night she proved she was anything but, until she stepped into death's path without hesitation, choosing him over her own safety. That moment had shattered every lie he had told himself. It had forced him to see that the only real thing in his world of violence and betrayal was this woman who loved him without conditions, who had given everything while asking for nothing. Clara, in turn, shared her own story. Growing up as a bargaining chip, always knowing her value was only transactional. Marrying him without illusions, accepting that she would never be loved. But somehow, despite everything, falling in love anyway, finding purpose in small gestures, in caring for him from a distance, in playing piano for an audience that didn't know it was listening. She told him about the loneliness, about the hundreds of small hurts that accumulated over the years, but also about the stubborn hope she couldn't quite extinguish. These conversations happened in the quiet hours, when the house was still and the rest of the world felt very far away. Raphael would hold her hand while they talked, his thumb tracing absent patterns on her skin, as if he needed the physical connection to believe she was real. Sometimes they would cry, releasing years of pain and misunderstanding. Sometimes they would laugh, discovering shared humor in unexpected places. And sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, finally at peace with each other's presence. By August, Clara was well enough to move around the house freely, though Raphael remained almost comically protective. He wanted her to rest more, to not push herself, to let others handle things. But Clara had spent 5 years being passive and peripheral. Now, with Raphael's love no longer in question, she wanted to live fully. She returned to her volunteer work at the community center, though now with Raphael's complete support rather than his indifferent permission. She resumed her piano playing, but now Raphael would openly join her in the music room, sitting nearby and watching her with undisguised pleasure. The change in their relationship rippled through the entire organization. Raphael, who had ruled through fear and strategic calculation, now led with a more balanced approach. He was no less effective, no less decisive, but there was a humanity to his decisions that hadn't been there before. His men noticed that he considered consequences more carefully, that he looked for solutions that minimized collateral damage. They attributed this change to Clara's influence, and they were right, though the influence worked both ways. Clara, for her part, was learning about Raphael's world in ways she never had before. He began including her in discussions about the business, seeking her perspective on decisions. She was shocked to discover that her insights, informed by her outsider's perspective and her natural empathy, often led to better outcomes. She helped negotiate a truce with a rival family by understanding what their real concerns were beneath the bluster. She suggested a charitable foundation as cover for certain operations, which both served a practical purpose and actually helped the community. Raphael listened to her, valued her opinions, made her a true partner in every sense. The attack that had almost killed them both had consequences in the underworld. Raphael's response had been swift and absolute, sending a clear message about the cost of such aggression. But rather than escalating into prolonged war, his approach had been surgical and final. The threat was eliminated, examples were made, and then Raphael had extended an unexpected olive branch to other families, proposing a new framework for coexistence that addressed underlying tensions. It was a masterful political maneuver, and Clara's influence was evident in its architecture. By fall, with leaves turning gold and crimson in Staten Island, Clara and Raphael had built something entirely new from the ashes of their arranged marriage. They had taken a transaction and transformed it into something authentic, something earned rather than assumed. They knew each other now, truly knew each other, in ways that went far beyond the surface compatibility of most marriages. There was a family gathering in late October, almost exactly 5 years after their wedding. The same people were there, in the same house, but everything was different. Raphael kept Clara close to his side all evening, his hand at the small of her back, his attention returning to her constantly. When someone made a toast to the family, Raphael stood and made one of his own. He raised his glass to Clara, called her his wife, his partner, his heart, in front of everyone. He thanked her for saving his life, but more than that, for teaching him that real strength included the courage to love without reservation. Clara felt the eyes of all the wives on her, saw the recognition in their faces. This was what marriage should be, what it could be when two people chose each other every day. The pity they had once felt for her had transformed into genuine respect, and perhaps even a bit of envy. She had what most of them had never achieved, what many had stopped believing was possible in their world. She had a husband who loved her as much as she loved him. That night, back at their home, Raphael led Clara to the terrace overlooking the city. The November air was crisp and cool, and he wrapped his coat around her shoulders to keep her warm. They stood together, looking out at the lights of New York, at the vast, complicated, beautiful mess of the world they inhabited. Raphael turned to her, cupped her face in his hands, and told her again what he had told her that first day after she woke, that she was his heart, his only real thing in this world. But this time, Clara said it back to him, told him that he was hers too, that they had both been lost but had found each other in the most unlikely way, that what they had now, this hard-won love built on sacrifice and truth, was more valuable than anything else they possessed, that she would choose him every day for the rest of her life, and that she would never regret the moment she stepped in front of that bullet. Raphael kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise. And in that kiss was everything they had been to each other and everything they would become. The quiet girl who had entered his house as an obligation had become the woman who made everything else matter. The cold boss who had married her without emotion had become the man who would burn the world down to keep her safe. They had transformed each other, saved each other, in ways that went far beyond that single moment of violence. As winter approached again, Clara and Raphael faced it together, truly together, for the first time. There would be challenges ahead, there always were in their world, but they would face them as partners, as equals, as two people who had found something rare and precious in the most unexpected place. Clara would continue her volunteer work, her piano playing, her quiet acts of kindness that balanced Raphael's harsher world. Raphael would continue to build his empire, but now with a conscience informed by love, with priorities that extended beyond power and control. They had started as strangers bound by duty. They had spent years existing in parallel, close, but never touching. But pain had torn away the barriers between them, and what they had discovered underneath was worth every moment of suffering that had preceded it. Clara had been told she would never be his real wife. Instead, she had become his everything. And Raphael, who had thought love was weakness, had learned it was the greatest strength he would ever possess. The music room saw more use now. Raphael would often join Clara there in the evenings, sitting quietly while she played. Sometimes he would stand behind her, his hands on her shoulders, and she would feel the tension ease out of him with each note. The piano had been her refuge during the lonely years, but now it was their shared sanctuary, a place where beauty existed without violence, where they could just be Clara and Raphael, not the roles their world demanded. Maria noticed that the house itself felt different now. There was laughter echoing through halls that had once been so quiet. There was warmth in rooms that had felt cold despite their expensive furnishings. The mansion had been a museum, a beautiful but lifeless space. Now it was a home, with all the messy, complicated, wonderful reality that implied. On their actual 5-year anniversary, Raphael did something unexpected. He planned a private ceremony, just the two of them and a priest, where they renewed their vows. But this time the words weren't empty ritual. This time, when Raphael promised to love and cherish Clara, his voice broke with emotion. This time, when Clara promised to stand by Raphael through whatever came, she knew exactly what that meant and chose it anyway. And this time, when they kissed as husband and wife, it was a kiss between two people who had earned the right to call each other those names. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had gotten married 5 years ago, but they had only really begun their marriage that night when violence had forced truth between them. Everything before had been prelude, preparation for the real thing. And now, finally, they had it. The real thing. The genuine article. A love story that had started with rejection and silence but had been rewritten through sacrifice and choice. As the night of their renewal ceremony ended, Raphael carried Clara to bed, mindful still of her healing wound even though it no longer caused her pain. He laid her down gently and joined her, pulling her close against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, and she matched her breathing to its rhythm. They lay like that in the darkness, wrapped around each other, no space between them. Raphael whispered into her hair that he loved her, that he had probably loved her for longer than he realized, that he was sorry for all the wasted time. Clara whispered back that there was nothing to forgive, that every moment had led them here, that she wouldn't change anything because it had given them this. And it was true. The pain had been necessary. The loneliness had been a kind of crucible. They had both needed to break before they could be rebuilt into something stronger. Sleep came easily that night, in a way it never had during the years of their separate existence. They slept tangled together, Raphael's arms secure around Clara, Clara's head on Raphael's chest. And if they both woke sometimes in the night reaching for each other to confirm that this was real, that they hadn't dreamed it, well, that was understandable. They had both spent so long alone that being found felt like a miracle. The sun would rise on their new life together. There would be challenges, complications, the inevitable difficulties of merging two people into one partnership, but they would face it all together, with honesty and trust and a love that had been tested in fire and had emerged unbreakable. Clara had thrown herself in front of a bullet for Raphael, but he had done something just as brave. He had let down his guard, admitted his feelings, and allowed himself to be vulnerable with the one person who had proven she would never use that vulnerability as a weapon, and that, in their world of violence and betrayal, where trust was the rarest commodity, was its own kind of miracle. A miracle built on sacrifice, on patience, on the stubborn refusal to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. A miracle named Clara and Raphael, who had started as strangers in a political arrangement and had become something far more valuable. Partners, friends, lovers. Two people who had found the real thing in the most unexpected place, and who would spend the rest of their lives grateful for the violence that had finally brought them together. Thank you for joining us for this emotional journey of Clara and Raphael. Their story reminds us that love can emerge from the most unexpected places, that patience and sacrifice can transform even the coldest hearts, and that sometimes we must lose everything to discover what truly matters. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives about love, redemption, and the human heart. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next story. And let us know in the comments what you thought about Clara and Raphael's journey from strangers to soulmates. Until next time, remember that the most powerful force in any world, whether it's ours or theirs, is the courage to love without reservation.